Welcome to part 2 of Making Feedback Work. This is concepts and examples of systemic feedback.
First of all, what do you mean by systemic feedback?
Sure. Just as interpersonal feedback is delivered from individuals, systemic feedback is from the human systems as a whole, of which you are a part. Let's compare feedback in your car. Your gas gauge and your speedometer give you feedback about specific activities of you driving your car. That's analogous to interpersonal feedback. However, when you're driving your car and everything continues to work, that it's working, that is actually systemic feedback that your car as a whole is doing what you want it to do. Likewise, if your car starts to make unfamiliar noises, that is feedback from your car that something is not working the way you want it to, that there's something going wrong with the relationships inside of your car, and you need to get that checked out. Remember from our human systems course, a system is doing whatever it is doing because each person in the system is doing what he or she is doing. Therefore, if the team is behaving the way you wish it to, that means whatever you are doing is effective. Conversely, if the team is not functioning the way you want it to, then that is feedback to you that says what you are doing as a leader of that team or as a member of that team is not being useful in terms of helping that team function well.
Well, could you give us an example of a leader not listening to systemic feedback?
You know, most of my clients call me because their teams are not working very well. There may be constant conflict, passive-aggressive sniping, or other examples of poor teamwork going on. Those team behaviors should be viewed by the leader when they're consistent as systemic, that those leaders are doing something that is not working. Conversely, if the teams are working well, that is systemic feedback that says what they're doing is working.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the team as a whole is a system, and so it gives you the behaviors of the team are reflections of what the leader is doing. So it kind of gives you that systemic feedback.
You know, the behaviors of teams is always a reflection of what the leader is doing and what everybody else is doing.
Good point. Yeah.
You can see then that systemic feedback is very useful and that it is always present. However, using systemic feedback requires us to notice it. To notice systemic feedback requires us to be conscious about our own intentions for being a part of that team. So we're back once again to conscious use of self, which is, remember, one of the three keys is your impact being aligned with your intention.
Got it. So when we look at, in your experience of, working with leaders, what types of systemic feedback do they typically miss?
Sure. Have you ever been in a group where there was just constant conflict, ceaseless finger pointing, consistently missed deadlines? Those are all systemic behaviors that leaders miss as feedback. Sorry, my chair just decided to go backward. In fact, any team behavior that is consistent over time is likely to be systemic. Too often when their teams or other human systems are not working well, leaders want to blame someone else. In those cases, those leaders are missing the systemic feedback that says that they too are contributing to what isn't working, and maybe they need to shift gears somehow.
I guess the other type of systemic feedback that people often miss, or leaders often miss, or sometimes they don't actually, it's maybe one of the ones that they do respond to, is when you have attrition. Like I worked at a place where people got to a certain level and then there was attrition. And so the leaders decided to, it was a consulting firm, so the leaders decided to look at why is there attrition at this point and what can we do about it. And they actually put some programs into place to
So
address the
you're
attrition.
saying people would get up to a certain point, then leave the
Correct.
organization? Okay.
Correct. And it had entirely to do with work-life balance. So, but yeah. So
and they were hearing that as systemic feedback and did something about it. That's good.
Yeah, it was
But
good.
it says that they were really paying attention, and so many leaders are simply not paying attention to that kind of systemic feedback.
Well, and it also goes back to your earlier point. I mean, it costs an enormous amount of money to bring people on board and take them off board, and people don't really see it because it's not always money out of pocket. It's time. It's the time of the recruiter and the HR people and the leaders and the interviewee. It's a lot of time to bring someone on board and then to offboard them. So,
Amen.
where are we going to go next now?
You know, another use of self here has to do with simply having intentions regarding our human systems. Many people do not believe that they have any impact on those around them. So they think, why bother to have any intention? It would actually be more accurate to say that everything we do does have an intention, conscious or not. So if we believe we have little or no influence in a system, our intention may be to stay out of the way or not to make the situation worse. But again, that is still having an impact. If it isn't helping the situation, it is simply condoning it to stay the way it is. We may also believe that we have some influence, but we may not know what to do with it to be more effective. Whatever you do, even being silent, will impact the system that you're in, for better or for worse.
So I mean, this goes back to the points that we made in the human system course, that there's no way not to have an impact on your human system. You always have an impact if you're a member of a human system. And even if we say nothing, we're having an impact. And we need to accept that and take responsibility for it. So I've sometimes heard this expressed, taking responsibility for your emotional wake. You know, as a leader, as a member of a team, that you're often creating, even if you're sitting there and doing nothing, the system is moving around you, and that creates an effect. It creates a wake. And we tend to want to avoid responsibility for our actions or inactions. So we do have to manage change in human systems, and that's, I think, super important to remember. I just wanted to add that reflection.
You know, that is such a powerful lesson. We always have the ability to create positive change in our human systems if we are willing to accept the fact that we are always having an impact. That is what empowers us. If we can see it that way rather than taking it as a burden, then the life would change.
Cool.
And that, my friend, is the job of the leader that you want to be.
Great, thank you. So Michael, do you have any final thoughts for us as we close out this module?
I do. It is always important for leaders who want to keep their teams moving in the right direction. Let's start with an example. A hospital executive asked me to see what was going on with his executive team. I did my usual interviews and gave him the bad news about his team's dysfunction. If he had set up a systemic feedback loop or two for his team, he would have saved himself the pain and expense of having to hire me. At least he knew that something was wrong. He didn't have the feedback loops, however, to give him these specifics. Leaders typically have feedback loops that tell them if their production and financial goals are being met. They review such feedback reports regularly. However, they rarely have such feedback loops for the human systems that actually create whatever productivity and financial success they're having. They may have an annual cultural survey, but a system will move in the direction that has the most frequent feedback loops. Once a year does not cut the mustard in terms of effective feedback loops.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it. That's a really good observation. We have these feedback loops on our financial reports and operations, but not our human systems. So we always know if we're making the number or not, but we don't always know whether we're making our teams as healthy as they could be and as effective as they could be. I think that's starting to change. I've seen some stuff coming out about employee engagement that's ongoing feedback for leaders. So we'll see if that really takes hold in organizations.
Feedback loops around human systems do not need to be complex. Doing a checkout after every team meeting to hear how folks thought the meeting went and how the next meeting could be improved is one simple way. Another would be to have a monthly meeting where the team's focus is simply on what's working and what's not working in our team. Doing these things consistently are important, since their frequency or lack of it tells the system what's important to pay attention to and what's not.
That's pretty basic and obvious, and thank you for bringing that up. I mean, just talking about what's working and what's not in terms of people's participation and energy in the organization, I think is super important. So let me just sum up what we talked about. We talked about the 3 principles of interpersonal feedback. Number 1, feedback says more about the giver than the receiver. That was one of the first things we talked about. The example of the dumb bunny was a great one. What the receiver does with the feedback is solely their choice. Making conscious choices is important instead of just reacting. And you help coach that young CFO to not react and just to take a pause and think about it and go ask what was going on. So that was great. And feedback is best when it connects to intentions or goals of the person you're giving feedback to, rather than the needs and goals of the giver. And you had that great example of the VP of accounting who wanted the employee to clean up their desk because she had a clean desk, nothing to do with the guy's intentions or goals. So that's a great example. And of course, we talked about systemic feedback. We just finished talking about it. We often forget about it. We don't always gather data about it. It's sometimes hard to see. And we have to be really intentional about gathering and using systemic feedback and building an ongoing feedback system for ourselves. So is there anything else that you want to add there, Michael?
I think you covered it. Just want to say, that number 1 principle, feedback always says something about the receiver, not necessarily anything about the giver, is so on target. Okay.
All right, thank you. And up next, we have an exercise.